Hello, everyone, and welcome to the IBJ podcast, where I speak with tech leaders, entrepreneurs, and researchers. Today, my guest is John Frechette. John is the founder of Sourced Economics, and we discuss utilizing academic literature when solving business questions, sales strategies, and the value of hard work. Welcome, John. I'm super glad we were doing this. And so maybe first start by introducing yourself.
Sure. Yep. Thanks a lot for having me, Ida. My name is John Frechette. You and I guess, got in touch, I want to say 6 months ago or maybe a year ago. And so you know a little bit of this background, but my background is I grew up in Massachusetts for what it's worth, though right now I'm in Arlington, Virginia, which is right outside of DC. It's a really wonderful place. This is where I started Sourced Economics, which is the company that I founded and now run. Started the company about 18 months ago. Long story short, my background is in management consulting. So I spent around 4 or 5 years at Ernst & Young. I actually worked in lots of different roles in that firm. I was an internal auditor, which is very unrewarding work, but you learn a lot in that role. Moved into their blockchain technology group for a couple of years and spent some time at some DC-based consulting firms, smaller consulting firms. And then, like I said, founded Sourced Economics in Arlington, Virginia. And yeah, that's when we got in touch, given our paths crossing in just kind of economic consulting and economic research.
So I have several questions right off the bat. You mentioned blockchain in Ernst & Young. I'm kind of curious what that involved.
Well, it's interesting. Ernst & Young, as you know, is a gigantic accounting firm, and obviously they have a big consulting arm as well. And so it actually was very difficult to almost convince the market that EY truly is doing some very, very cool things in the blockchain technology space. So what did that entail? Well, I think there were, not to get in the nitty gritty of it, but there were two main parts of their business. One was they were actually building blockchain-based business applications for supply chain and procurement and all sorts of interesting finance applications like managing the order-to-cash process and whatnot. And they were building all of that, by the way, for any blockchain wonks listening, they were building it on public Ethereum, which was unique. Lots of companies are doing private blockchain solutions. They were building on public. The second part of that business was all of the audit and analytics surrounding it. And a lot of that business was with the smaller but quickly growing crypto companies and startup blockchain companies. And so what did my role entail? Well, I was actually, funny enough, basically chief of staff to the leader of that business. And so I kind of had a hand in everything, and it was a great experience. So worked on, I would say at first, lots of operations and, doing things like managing budget requests from leadership teams, building marketing materials, just getting on calls and trying to wrangle people together, to sort of support one unified strategy. Towards the end, though, it became a business development and, let's say, typical consulting role where I was actually managing projects. So it was, there's no doubt that wouldn't have been able to start Sourced Economics if it weren't for that experience. So blockchain is a cool place to be. And blockchain within EY is a really cool place to be. Yeah.
So that leads to the second question I was going to ask. What led you to start Sourced Economics? And of course, tell us also what Sourced Economics does. But what I'm really interested in is I imagine a lot of people who want to start a business, they are in this space where they're like, I really want to do it, but I don't know if this is the right moment. So I'm very curious about that process.
Yeah, it's always a tough question to answer because there was obviously many converging factors. I think, Ida, part of it was that, so it just so happened that I had the good fortune to be working in these roles while also getting the graduate degree in economics, which is really my passion. And so I think just being able to do that parallel track, working in one field and then really killing myself to pick up the academic literature and pick up the lessons in university is what really, I think, made me partly recognize the opportunity. Then it was just my risk appetite, I guess, that allowed me to materialize it. But the point is, I think the number one finding that started it all was the idea that academic papers were not being leveraged appropriately. Let's just say generally in a business setting. I say generally in a business setting because once again, I was very fortunate. I across EY and across some of the other organizations I worked at, I worked with supply chain and with procurement and with what I'll call just corporate strategy and finance, lots of different teams. And I never saw an academic paper referenced once anywhere. And there were some big questions being asked that in which I did think there was probably a whole mountain of literature to address. And actually, for what it's worth, our very first kind of PowerPoint presentation had a slide in it that had something like, I can't remember the title exactly. It was some catchy title, said for every strategic topic or challenge imaginable, there are 10,000 academic papers that have been published to address that exact topic. And then it had a nice picture of a quick little Google search we did with, supply chain resilience. Work from home was a big, obviously big topic and still is. Labor supply and demand volatility, and all of the corresponding numbers of papers. So that was at least the idea we built around from a marketing perspective. I certainly thought we would end up doing a lot of our own mathematics and a lot of our own econometrics, and indeed we have, but it turns out there is a very real untapped market for transforming the empirical findings in academic literature for these types of stakeholders. And by the way, what that has evolved into, we started very broad, like I said, supply chain, finance, procurement, and we really narrowed and honed in on, I'd say, 3 departments. Let's say global strategy or strategy is one of them, commercial excellence or commercial strategy is another, and then what many would call market intelligence would be the third. So for those 3 teams, that initial message really panned out around academic literature. And also, as we've talked about in the past, we do a lot of, econometrics as well. So that is the not so short summary of, the idea we started with and how it's evolved since. And we're still working on it, obviously.
So the types of companies where you see there is this appetite for implementing findings from academic literature and those findings haven't been implemented yet. Is there a type of firm where that's most applicable? Is it big, small firms? What industry?
Well, let's see. It's a great question. And it's one, I could spend a lot of time on. In terms of accounts, there are definitely some specific criteria. And I know this because when I was starting out, it was myself and a few professors, basically. So I was doing all the business development. And indeed, we had just about no filter for which companies we were sending emails to and calling. It was every single industry, including professional services and consulting, by the way, and just about anything over a couple hundred employees or even 100 employees. Since then, obviously we've whittled it down. We are, just by nature of our ability to sell and our ability to, by the way, divide labor enough internally to get competitive in certain areas, we are not doing much around financial services. And, the main reason for that is they have big economics departments. They have, lots of economists working there already. So we would need to have internal team members super focused on the literature on some type of asset pricing if we wanted to be competitive in that environment. Smaller companies also, Ida, you might have found this as well. I think if we were a macroeconomic research firm and we were about forecasting and translating, economic economic data releases, there would be a nice middle market for us with companies, a couple hundred employees to 1,000 employees, something like that. But because we do mostly microeconomics, and we can get into why this is the case, but our market is really 1,000 plus, 2,000 plus, and larger companies. And so within that still very broad market that is non-financial services, non-professional services, over a couple thousand, you still need to find the right stakeholders. There are a lot of people within these organizations that rationally don't have much time to think about academia, and they don't have much time to think about these crazy econometrics and mathematics. because their main job and what they're very good at is operating and fighting fires and getting things done, if you will, and wrangling stakeholders and selling, let's say. And so you do need to find the right stakeholders that have a genuine interest in, I view it as people who have a long time horizon and might be charged with, for instance, trying to understand how their markets will change over the next, not 6 months, but 1 year, 2 year, 3 year to 5 year. And those are the types of people that we sell and deliver to. That's what it seems to me. So, yeah.
That makes sense. And that was actually my next question, because I find that often when people are not familiar with these types of tools, right, understandably, they're skeptical or they just don't want to, quote unquote, waste their time on it. So I was curious how you find the people who are receptive. And I guess my kind of add-on question is, in those companies, do you find that those tools are not being utilized because there is no in-house expertise, or there may be in-house expertise, but it just does not get kind of communicated to the top, to those decision makers that you're able to reach?
It is most certainly both. And it depends on the project, whether it's, 40-60 or 60-40. No doubt, particularly when it comes to the econometrics we do, we are hiring and recruiting people who are very, very good at econometrics. And I would like to think better than the average, data science analyst, no doubt. But for example, when it was just me, I'm not that good of an econometrician. I think I'm pretty okay at communicating the concepts, and I'm pretty okay at identifying use cases, communicating the outcomes, et cetera. But the econometrics that we were doing, even with the group of professors I had prior to actually getting some great econometricians on board, were inevitably being done within the organizations we were working for, or certainly could be done. And so indeed, a big part of it has to do with just large organizations are made up of, millions and infinite markets internally. And so there are huge transaction costs to getting the output of a data science analyst to a decision maker in the corporate finance group or something like that. And so I do think part of our niche has been being able to get to those stakeholders and communicate those types of findings. So long story short, that is a big part of it. However, no doubt, I do feel that if you really surveyed even all of the economists within a very large organization, you won't find many economists or analysts using academic papers and leveraging academic empirical findings from academic literature quite like we are, and certainly not as much as we are. So it's both. And to what extent it, each plays a role depends on the use case and the methods we're using. Yep.
So I don't think I have talked to anyone who has emphasized the use of academic literature in business in this way. And so I'm curious if you have any examples, of some examples of problems. Are the papers typically newer? Because, the space I work in, it's mostly would be looking, like we certainly use papers, and that would mostly be econometric methods. Like, what are some recent econometric methods for synthetic controls or some causal inference?
Sure.
And that's pretty common in tech, but that's a very specific use case.
So there are many, many examples that come to mind, and I'm really not exaggerating when I say every single day we're tearing through academic papers. And of course, we've tried to get a little bit more efficient about it. So we use Scholar AI, the extension of GPT, for instance, which summarizes academic papers and goes as far as doing meta-analyses where they can actually consolidate, regression tables into one table. It's really interesting. But the point is, I think, right now we have a project going on that relates to the impacts of lightweighting of vehicles on a couple different kind of target variables. One is on sustainability related metrics, on overall, automotive production, and on the forecast for automotive production. And so, that is an exercise where we are it's really not enough just to, let's say, go to the conclusions of a paper and try to figure out what are the estimated impacts on 2025 automotive production from a 15% lightweighting of vehicles. What are the estimated impacts on costs and willingness to pay amounts? You really do want to learn about these, let's call it the structures of those impacts, which geographies are most affected, how has that changed over time? The only way to not necessarily get the final results, but the only way to really pick off those critical empirical findings is to just read the thing. And so, yes, we spend a lot of time reading academic papers, and that's a good example. I know that our very first project was for a large consumer products company, and it happened to be our most abstract topic and research question we worked on. And here was the research question. Our business is slowly becoming a bimodal organization that is unprompted and without any specific direction. Our business is organizing into two different units. One is focused specifically on digital investments that are much more long-term. The other is focused on managing our more industrialized technology business, our cloud environments and our production environments. And the question was, what are the different trade-offs associated with that, and how should we be thinking about it? And as a leadership team, how and should we enable this change, and what should we be concerned about, information sharing and whatnot? And you can see how that is, we pride ourselves on being able to put almost anything into the context of an econometric model. That is a tough one. So the only way really to address that question, and this was, again, our first project, was to do a massive review of, I think in the end there were over 50 papers across organizational economics, transaction cost economics, let's say some sociology spin-off topics around organizational psychology. And we just did a humongous literature review of those papers. And indeed, what we presented was A, a list of trade-offs, and B, I think a really robust analytical model that demonstrated, for instance, how changes in the macroeconomic environment actually changed a company's propensity to make or buy projects, that is, insource or outsource projects, and their propensity to decentralize their organization. So that is a particular example of a super abstract topic, but it's a nice example of one that it's hard to really even come up with the underlying logic to start to answer the question without leveraging academic research.
Yeah,
Yep.
I think that's a fascinating example, and I feel like it highlights what economists tend to be good at, which is taking abstract questions and kind of making up a framework for doing this.
Sure.
And so when you look for those papers, there may be topics where a paper that's 80 years old is as applicable as a paper that came out last year. And for other
Yep.
topics, you actually may want to have newer papers, right? Like the car example. I imagine an 80-year-old paper on cars is maybe less relevant. And do you have any insights on this?
The nuances, this is why it's very difficult to use, at least anytime in the near future, to really seriously rely on a tool like Scholar AI. And indeed, we hope to be the leaders in figuring out how to leverage those tools in industrializing them for literature reviews. Having said that, right now it's very difficult because the process to actually extract, like I've said, statistics and empirical findings and theories from these papers and transform them is super nuanced. So to answer your question, I think when it comes to a question like organizational structure, indeed, right there, smack dab in the middle of a client presentation was a reference to The Nature of the Firm, which is from 1937. And indeed, we got the feedback that, well, is there anything more recent? And I remember specifically, we were asked to lay out a timeline. I think the specific question was, how have the explanatory variables of innovation changed, the explanatory variables that are studied and analyzed changed over time? So you get things like sustainability and diversity in the later years. Early years, lots of people talk about market structure and competition. And so indeed, that at the time, at the beginning, we didn't recognize that obviously that needs to be something you do, but nonetheless, even today, we are indeed referencing papers from certainly the 80s, 90s, even the 70s. However, like I said, it's very nuanced. You need to be able to actually evaluate those papers first on the surface level. That is, you have to understand the universities of the authors who are publishing them. You want to understand the number of citations they've accrued, because it's a very calculated process figuring out what papers you should spend your time on. And then within them, I do think you need to figure out which empirical findings and which theories would and should stand the test of time. And so things related to transaction cost economics seem to us to absolutely stand the test of time in terms of just the comparative statics of more decentralized versus more centralized organization. However, when it comes to a topic like understanding the impacts of oil price inflation on production in some industry, you certainly can't expect to pull a single coefficient out of a paper and use that, out of a paper from the 80s or 90s and use that in today's study. What you can maybe pull out are findings regarding differences in the structures of the oil industry. So that paper might have found that from the 60s to the 80s, the oil industry became more concentrated, and that meant the impacts from oil price inflation was lessened or worsened. Something like that you can judgmentally look at and say, this seems to be a natural economic phenomenon that will not change over the course of time. And you find an interesting way, I think, it's to integrate into your overall story and message and presentation. So again, it is incredibly nuanced. Last thing is, that is not only the case for looking at a study that's 50 years old. Even the peer review process is I happen to be more bullish on it than others, but of course there are plenty of ideas that get published that I don't feel are very good and don't reconcile well with the prevailing theories and literature of a particular area. And so even within something that could have been published last year or this year, you still need to seriously scrutinize the theories that come out of them. And so, like I said, we can go deeper and deeper into that, but it's a very nuanced process. And yes, part of that is you assign slightly less weight to older papers, but that's one of many different criteria.
Yeah, and I think it highlights that for these kinds of ambiguous questions, right? Like often there is no, I guess, historical precedent. And often when we do quote unquote forecasting, there may be a historical precedent, but that doesn't mean that history will repeat itself. So there always needs to be explainability to, this is the result I have, and these are the economic drivers behind it. And at least for me, I think that's what makes economics very interesting, because it's so, it's not obvious, right, what the answer should be. And so
that's a big problem that you mentioned, is how do you, it's a very practical problem. It's a business problem. The stakeholders that we engage with are, I think, very senior people within their organizations, have a lot of priorities, and we think about it a lot, coming at it with very little reputation on our side. Obviously, we're growing our reputation, but how do you help them, not only the stakeholders we work with, but the internal team members that they're maybe forwarding our studies around to, for instance? How do you help them gain comfort over the validity of your findings and your recommendations and whatnot? At first glance, it would be surprising to some to see us referencing a paper from the 1900s or from the 1990s even, or by the way, even some people would push back against like a 2005 paper. How do we convince them and document our assumptions and communicate our assumptions that lay out why exactly we feel these are still relevant empirical findings? And by the way, usually it comes down to that they reconcile well with more recent studies. And so how do we explain that and communicate it in a timely fashion and in a way that doesn't involve, providing to them a 30 or 40 page methodology paper, which we've done, and it hasn't gone so well. So it's definitely a problem we're always dealing with. I think it's just it's a slow grind. And what it takes, Ida, is you have to be on calls and you have to be presenting directly to them. If you send a study via email that has all sorts of crazy equations and references and whatnot, you won't get anywhere. You have to be on the calls, building trust, and by extension, implementing your research. So yeah, it's got to be a part of our business.
So would you say the format that works best in your experience is basically a call with a well-made PowerPoint with good visuals, no equations, right? Or almost no equations, but basically something that's very kind of user-friendly on the eye, and then of course a good story.
I think generally that's right. We do get on, when we kick off an account, for instance, we do ask them, what is the best delivery format? What will sell best internally? What do people consume the best? And indeed, PowerPoint is usually the answer. Having said that, this isn't an important detail to this discussion, but we operate generally on a subscription model. And what that means is, our work is recurring, where it's less about, or it's as much about, sure, we get to know the company better and their products, and sort of get to, we're on standby in case some major market developments occur, and we can comment on those. But I think even more important than that is getting to know the different stakeholders internally, getting to know the processes internally, understanding how internal communications happen. And once you know that well, you become much more effective at selling your research, if you will, internally. But to your point, that is almost always via a PowerPoint deck. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And you mentioned you work with academic professors. And so in academia, there is a range of kind of how close the research is to quote unquote the real world, right? Like some people do very theoretical things, maybe like some, I don't know, theoretical microeconomics that's very mathematical, but the applicability of it is kind of further out, right? It's like it's not immediate from the paper. And then some people, of course, do very applied research. So how do you choose the professors you work with, and do you ever need to translate what their output into something that's even more business friendly?
Oh, for sure. To answer your second question, absolutely. I mean, I think that's what we think of as, I'd like to think we produce some great transformations ourselves and whatnot, but then a big part of what we do is we're an intermediary, if you will. We are taking the raw materials of research and ideas from the university professors we work with. We are adding new inputs and transforming them to be more marketable and useful for clients and prospects, and then delivering those. And so we're a step in that supply chain. Having said that, yes, I think, how do we choose? It's a great question. I wouldn't say, Ida, that I think we choose actually mostly just based on the relevance of the research topics and research interests of those professors. We don't concern ourselves too much with how abstract or quantitative or practical the research produced by these professors are. And if we did, we would probably be more targeting the, kind of business school and management science researchers than we are the economics researchers, because as you probably know, the management science literature is super understandable. Generally, there are some very clear applications from those studies, but we also feel it's less rigorous and there's just less arbitrage there, because a lot of those ideas are either reaffirming existing hypotheses held by business executives, or they make their way into business strategy pretty quickly. And so, yeah, it's actually, how do we choose? I think it is, frankly, at this stage, it's about research interest, and then also who is really excited about the prospect of working at a startup, frankly, or supporting a startup. And I would also say, along those lines, we are so unbelievably fortunate to work on big, exciting problems. And I'd like to think the professors we work with really value that as well. And so who wants to work at a startup? Who wants to work on these types of problems, I guess, would really be the two main criteria.
Yeah, and I imagine that's already a great filtering mechanism to
It
Filter
certainly
out the
is.
people who just want to sit in the basement and like never talk to a human, right? And just do some
That's
abstract
right.
research.
Yep. Yep. Exactly.
And so, do you have any thoughts on entrepreneurship in general? You said you started 18 months ago. So I'm sure, like, what are, for example, the things that were unexpected in this journey?
Well, in entrepreneurship in general, I think that the first thing I did when I mean, it's funny, I felt like, and probably many people feel this way, I had this lingering idea for an economic research firm that services, let's say, senior executives, strategy professionals, et cetera. And I felt like this idea was lingering in my head, and it took some time for it to just come to the front of my head. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but it's a lot like actually when you find an interesting contribution you can make in the academic literature. And I'm not going to pretend to be, someone who's a great academic researcher, but I think it's you have to get good at amplifying those new ideas that come into your head and almost convince yourself that they're possible. Having said that, when I did recognize or felt like I had an opportunity worth exploring, I know from my time at EY and for any entrepreneur, it's helpful to know that the best way to become an expert at something quickly and to really, in this case, flesh out a business case for sourced economics and understand our niche is to just get on calls with people. And I know I've already mentioned that you just have to set up calls and get on calls. And one of the best pieces of advice I got at the beginning, it's different for other businesses, but for mine, one of the best pieces of advice was it's so easy to get caught up in building nice websites and, fancy PowerPoint decks. Obviously, you do need PowerPoint decks, but it's easy to get caught up in the fun parts of a startup. You just need to sell. You just need to get out there and sell and sell and sell. And sales, to some extent, if you can get good at the selling and get good at the business development, then everything will follow, every single thing. Now, that leads into your second question, Ida. What surprised me? I've worked in consulting, worked in accounting. It's not like I have this extremely long career, but I have had some diverse experiences, worked in technology. Nothing is harder than business development, I think. I think sales is so difficult, partly because it's so volatile. One day is the greatest day ever. The next day is absolutely horrendous. You lose a deal and it's just terrible. And so that was the biggest learning curve for me as an entrepreneur. I had done some business development work at Ernst & Young, quite a bit of it actually, but still going out into the abyss with no reputation and just, kind of relentlessly selling. It takes so much persistence. Like I said, it's so volatile. You have to be pivoting every second of every day based on the smallest nuggets of feedback. Every pitch matters. Every meeting matters. The point is, that was the biggest thing that I knew it would be tough, but the sales and business development, if you can get good at that, it is a very powerful skill, whether you're an entrepreneur or in any other profession.
Right. And I think the first thing you said, right, about just going out there and selling instead of focusing on making your website perfect and your PowerPoint and your LinkedIn link and all of that, right? It's very common for any kind of creators to get caught up in making something perfect, right? It's like a mental crutch. I'm not going to start until it's perfect.
Sure.
And in the end, there's no shortcut, right? You're just going to do it. And that's the only way to learn.
It's repetition. I mean, even the pitches themselves. The first pitch I had was to an EY alumni member. He was a VP at a large bank, and it was just horrible. I mean, it was just absolutely terrible. I fumbled a lot of points. I didn't have good answers to his questions. I didn't follow up well. And then the second one was better. Third one was pretty darn good. And then it's nonlinear. After a few difficult attempts, even in those pitches, you really take off. And by the way, this is, again, not relevant for every company, but cold calling, cold emailing, all of that is certainly the same exact thing. At the beginning, it's very tough, and then it gets easier and easier. So,
and so that was actually my next question for this selling. How do you reach out? Do you look on LinkedIn? Do you find company websites? Like, do you just do all of it? Like, do you typically identify a company and then find the person to reach out to, and then whether it's LinkedIn or email or whatever it may be?
So at the beginning, I had a little bit of a process, but it was very sporadic, just kind of furiously calling and emailing and messaging on LinkedIn. I mean, those are the three channels I think that are most: calling, emailing, LinkedIn messaging. All three are just about equally effective. All three together, I think, are really powerful. But at the beginning, like I said, there were cold emails. Yes, I would say it was. I wouldn't say it was an account based filtering. I think when we get larger sales organizations do have more account based strategies where one rep or two reps might be in charge of specific accounts. Ours was more just, this industry over, let's say, a couple thousand employees, private companies, and what we're looking for is this title. And that title would generally be Chief Strategy Officer, VP Sales Strategy, VP Intelligence, something like that. And so yes, at the beginning, then it was just call, email, especially before we had clients. Probably some days you'd make over 100 calls. In reality, probably 80 calls a day, something like that. And then I will say, Ida, since that point, I keep saying we're very fortunate. We've been fortunate to bring in client accountants and build a little bit of a business here. And Seth Watson, who you've met virtually, he, I think, came in and really industrialized that sales process. And so now it is much more formal. He does have specific accounts that he targets. He has very specific, what he calls ICPs, I think ideal customer profiles. And a big part of it is taking the industry case studies, let's say the case study within food and beverage, and talking about that specifically to, obviously, others in food and beverage. Bigger task than you would think to create those campaigns and do it on an industry by industry basis. But so at the beginning, it was just complete insanity. And now it is much more formal and structured, but it remains email, LinkedIn, call. Yep.
Yeah, that definitely sounds like lots of real work that there's no shortcut here, right? Like, you got to reach out and it has to be tailored and has to be well done. And so do you have any advice for, I guess, aspiring, maybe think of someone who's like an econ student and they're thinking about their career and they have the option to go into consulting, try to start something on their own with no experience, go into tech. Do you have any thoughts on the pros and cons of those different paths?
No, I guess, the only thing I didn't, as you know, I didn't have the traditional economics background. I studied finance undergrad, went into consulting, then got my graduate degree in economics. Then that's when I kind of forced my way into the field of economic consulting. I have heard from many PhD candidates, for instance, that I interview, them hearing things from their professors like, you should go into industry and get industry experience right off the bat or something. I don't know if I subscribe to that necessarily. I certainly think industry experience is obviously useful. And if that's what you want to do, you should. But I was pretty darn close to moving, full gear into academia. I happen to love, my capstone in my master's degree was supposed to be an econometrics project. I pushed and pushed and pushed and finally was able to do a theory paper. That's kind of the paradox, is that here I am, I hope really making economic research actionable. And in reality, I love abstract theory and the history of economic thought. And so I would tell people to just pursue their passions and don't, I wouldn't follow any rigid rules like go get industry experience or go work in government or you need to stay in academia and go tenure track if you want to do this. Having said that, I would say specific to the people that are really interested in some way, shape, or form pursuing their economics studies more, broadly, I would say that the biggest, and I'd be curious to hear yours, Ida, the biggest difference, I think, between me and maybe some of the other students I was studying with, for better or worse, was that I was spending a lot of my time on academic papers. And I was spending a lot of time, for instance, reading economists from the 1700s, 1800s, and 1900s, and thinking really intensely about academic literature. I keep going back to that topic. It's obviously a passion of mine, but I do think it gives you an interesting perspective. When a lot of people, especially undergrad and masters, they have their little literature review section of their papers, and they, find a few relevant studies and they list out a few econometric findings, and that's pretty much it. Really taking the time to think critically about the history of the economic literature on a particular topic, how it's evolved, how it relates to other pieces of literature. I just think it's crucial, and I can't explain it other than to say that it has many more applications in the real world than you would think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so I agree, and I think that the key phrase that you just said is to think critically.
Yep.
Right? I think to a large extent the education system has gone away from like thinking deeply and critically about kind of key pieces of thought. And to your point, it's not that it has to be a new paper, right? I mean, these older economists, and I'm sure it applies to almost all disciplines, that thought deeply about something in the 1700s, right? Like that's still relevant. And so I think it's, instead of treating the literature review as like an extra that you kind of have to add to your paper, being able to actually take the time to think about it is very beneficial, right? Which, you're an example of. Your company exists thanks to your ability to do that.
Yeah, I think part of it might just be, frankly, it might not even be, to your point, application specific to economics. It could just be that doing that really strengthens muscles that are, hard to exercise otherwise. I do know, in very seriously getting obsessed with economic literature, it certainly helps you gain in appreciation for science broadly. And that kind of informs, for what it's worth, all of your views on life and your political views and whatnot. And so I do think that's a part of it. I also think that if you genuinely would like to, either in the near term or in your life, let's say you're a PhD candidate, if you genuinely want to make a significant contribution, then then you genuinely need to understand the literature. I don't know what else to say. Seth, I just mentioned, he has a nice little phrase. He says, you can't think outside the box until you know what's inside the box. And that's a nice phrase to use. And it speaks to the fact that, again, at what point are you actually hungry, not to get published or something like that, but to make a contribution? If you're hungry for that, then you're hungry to know, what's been done. I don't know how else to describe it.
I love that phrase about the box, because we live in a day and age where like you can scroll and click and everything is fast, right? And you can kind of have a cursory view of a million topics in a second. So I don't know, I'm really old fashioned. I believe in reading paper books and actually knowing how it is to immerse yourself in one thing without distractions.
Sure.
I'm very on board with that thinking.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I try to read books as best as I can. People always, people are critical of me because I go to the beach and I bring, the theory of moral sentiments, or I bring like a textbook or something like that. Probably not the best strategy, but I try to read books as much as I can. I know the way it manifests for me is just reading papers. I just read so many papers, and I read papers about papers. I read book reviews, and I try to read books as much as possible. But I think you're right, being able to really focus on something. And frankly, there is maybe no more, I don't want to get abstract here or sound a little bit silly. There's no more out-of-body experience, or hardly any, than when a concept just kind of locks into place. And I know, especially when you're trying to get a handle on the literature of, like I said, the 1800s and 1900s, you might have to read a paper 5 times, or read a book 5 times for that matter. And sometimes you slowly chip away at a problem, but sometimes it really just locks into place and you fully understand the concepts. And anyways, it is a it's a war of attrition. You have to really exercise your muscles in your brain to be able to do that.
Yeah, I love this, and maybe this is a good note to end on, unless there's any other closing thought you feel you would like to share.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, I think that pretty much covers it. I just want to thank you, Ida, for obviously having me on the podcast. Really enjoy all of our discussions, not just this one. And the only closing thought I'd have is maybe yet again just another piece of advice for economics students and students of all sorts of, all students, I guess. And that is that nothing really substitutes hard work in terms of getting on top of a field of science. I mean, I had the luxury of being able to stay up incredibly late and read just paper after paper after paper, lots of crinkled up, problem sets that I threw into the corner of my apartment and stuff like that. And so it is a very serious grind, I think, learning the syntax, the mathematics, and the structures of the literature of a field of science. But I don't know, Ida, how to say it. I feel there are probably too many students that come out of even their graduate degrees in economics without gaining a full appreciation of the field, or as much as they should. And so nothing substitutes hard work, I guess, when it comes to studying this stuff. That's probably what I'd leave it on.
I love this. I couldn't agree more. And I think, there are some fields like, say, exercise, right, where it's very apparent that there is no substitute for hard work. And if you went to the gym, if you did a not very good set, or if you put in an honest set of, whatever squats, right? And so it's very apparent. And I think when it comes to, I guess, business and intellectual endeavors, it kind of gets diluted, and you can watch TikTok or whatever and get this idea that you can materialize money by thinking about it or something like that, right? But it's exactly the same. There's no substitute for hard work, I think, anywhere in life.
Yep, exactly.
So,
no, I completely agree. And so, yes, that would be our closing statement. And I think, like I said, really appreciate the discussion. I'm sure we'll talk again, maybe do another episode in the future.